to Shirey real quick, and she's going to bring you some information that we were wonderfully favored with when we went to Indianapolis.
All right, so we got, should we say, the opportunity or the pleasure to listen to a talk by a Dr. Dan Pompa. And what was interesting about him is he started his journey in learning about toxins and heavy metals and things like this because of his own experience. Even though he was a doctor, he started to have these health issues such as panic attacks. All of a sudden he became gluten intolerant. Said he was irritable, he was in extreme pain, almost to the point where he didn't want to live anymore. And so he started digging and trying to figure out what was going on. And it was through talking to other doctors and a colleague that he realized that he might possibly have mercury toxicity. And so they did the test and found out that he had very high levels of mercury. He had actually had some mercury fillings removed and it had released into his bloodstream a few days before he started having these problems. And so that's what began his journey of trying to find out more about these toxins and how they affect the body. And so I like the fact that he'd experienced it himself, and that's what led to that. So we know that oftentimes that's what motivates us to get better is when we're sick. And so some of the information that he shared with us was about 3 toxins that he said affect 4 generations. Can any of you think of some toxins that maybe affect your parents' generation? Maybe some things that we watch for now? Lead. Yeah, lead was a big one. Asbestos is one too, but the 3 that he focused on, one of them was lead. Mercury, we mentioned the fillings. And the last one was glyphosate. Does anybody know what that is? Have they heard of glyphosate?
Spell it.
Glyphosate. Roundup. Exactly.
Who
And
answered
so,
that?
Tom.
Good job, David.
David.
You got 2 points.
And what's interesting about it is you notice he said affected 4 generations. So that means that if your parents are exposed to something, that then it can affect you. And you might think, well, how is that possible? And that's because whenever your mother is carrying you, where do we store toxins? Does anybody know? Anybody want to guess? We store it in our fat, and lead, for instance, is even stored in our bones. And so during pregnancy, those toxins are released. And so then the child, or even the embryo, is able to receive all those toxins. And then when they're born, they're already born with what we would call a toxic or chemical burden already. And so there was some studies that they did on this, and they found that embryos are exposed to as many as 287 toxins, and 180 of those are known to cause cancer. And so from the get-go, we're already experiencing toxicity. And so there's actually 2 different ways that we experience it, through our mother and then through our genetics. And I'll talk a little bit more about the genetics when we talk about mercury. And so what's interesting about lead is that lead in your body, it actually displaces calcium in your brain. And so it's very chemically similar to calcium. And so this is how I understand it, is we're going to look at this for the gut as well as the blood-brain barrier. You actually have a barrier in your brain where blood can then allow certain things to go through into your brain, right? And so we have these things on the outside of this barrier, and we have these things on the inside. And so what they're finding is that if this lead acts like calcium, it's able to go through this membrane into your brain, right? And then when it does that, it's able to displace calcium. Calcium is really important for development, right? And so what they're finding is from this lead exposure that it's actually affecting people's brains. And so they saw increase in crimes, Alzheimer's, things like these. You think of some of the things we're going to talk about in children, like ADHD or autism could be affected by some of these toxins, and that's because it's allowed to go into the brain. So another thing they realized it affected, which all of you could probably guess, is your gut microbiome. And so that's why I use this to kind of explain both of them. So we also have a barrier in our gut that allows these things to get into our bloodstream. And what we find these toxins do is they actually cause a gap in this barrier where things that would normally be in your gut can now go into your blood. And that could even include food and things like that. And that's where you hear things like leaky gut syndrome, or you find that people become more sensitive to foods. You hear things like Hashimoto's disease and other autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, there's a lot of things. And so it's affecting our gut, and then that in turn affects our weight. And so they're finding that ones that are exposed to lead and things like these, they're having an increase in obesity. And you would think in adults, right? But the study they did here in Boston was actually on children. So lead is one thing that he looked at. Another one that he looked at was mercury. Can anybody think of one way we can be exposed to mercury, or any of the ways that we could be?
Fish.
Huh? It did mention seafood. It said, but they weren't sure how much of that was because of the toxicity from the industry itself, or because of the exposure to the seafood with mercury, like say tuna, like you mentioned. Light bulbs.
Correct.
Mercury is in a lot. They looked at the biggest ways we're exposed to it. We know it's in all in our environment. What did you say? Fluorescent bulbs. Yeah, it's in a lot of different things. But the biggest ways it looked at was fillings in your teeth, amalgam fillings, and the second thing was vaccinations. And so what they found in one study that they did is that the more fillings you had, the more mercury your organs were exposed to. And so there's two different ways, obviously, that can affect you. If we get a filling, but what if your mother had fillings, and then, you know, while she was pregnant, she released the toxins from those? And so what they found is that the amount of mercury in aborted embryos decreased in infants corresponds to the number of fillings present in their mother. So the more fillings the mother had, the higher levels they had of the mercury toxicity. And so if we have them ourselves, or if our mother had them whenever we were developing, basically. And so again, they correlated it to obesity. And what I liked about this part of his presentation, and it kind of helped me to better understand how genetics came into it, because they actually did a study on mice, and basically they injected these toxins, and what they found is these mice became diabetic and they became obese. And so what was even more interesting is that their parents were normal, right? These mice, well, think of it this way. And so they're injected with these things, they became obese and diabetic. Well, when they had children, guess what happened to their children? They also became obese and diabetic. So even though they weren't directly exposed to the toxins that their parents were, they basically inherited the same dysfunctions. And so that's why they say it affects 4 generations. So it's your development, but it's also epigenetics. So what were your parents' exposed to that then they passed down, or that changed the genes where you then would inherit certain factors, right? So then you might wonder, well, you know, what do you do about it? So what they did is they were actually able to give these mice what they call methylators to change that process in that gene, so that these mice were then able to lose weight and have normal blood sugar again. And so that's something we'll talk about a little bit with the Purify. It's more about how to reverse that process. And so the very last thing that he talked about, oh, I forgot one thing too, is flu shots. If an individual had 5 consecutive flu shots between 1970 and 1980, their chances of Alzheimer's was 10 times higher, because vaccinations also contain mercury. So that's another way that we could be affected by mercury, is from vaccinations.
They did then, but do they now?
There was a time frame for that.
Yeah, there are still several of the vaccinations that they're using with mercury. Last time I was informed on it, basically you had to ask your doctor for a vaccination without mercury in it, especially for the children. So that was a really big thing. I mean, you had to ask for it. They just didn't automatically not give you the mercury one, because the mercury is the standard across the board. But the alternative is not necessarily a whole lot better either, because they still have to find a sterilizer for those vaccinations because of the things that they're using for them. But you do have to ask for a non-mercury based vaccination if you're going to do that.
Yeah.
So the two biggest ways with mercury, the ones the highest chances of being exposed, was through fillings in your teeth or your parents, and through the vaccinations. So the next thing that he talked about was glyphosate. And the interesting thing about glyphosate, not only is it toxic for you, but it also makes other heavy metals more toxic. And that's one reason why I wanted to use this diagram to help you to understand that. And the interesting thing about glyphosate, it's just like lead, it mimics another important nutrient that you need for your body. And so glyphosate is similar to the amino acid glycine. And so it is able to move and go places in your body it normally wouldn't because of that. And so what it does is it actually makes it possible, and I got a little red dot there for the glyphosate, but it makes it possible for some of these other molecules that normally couldn't get through that barrier to your brain to be able to go through. And so that's the reason why they're seeing higher rates of autism and things like that in children, is because of glyphosate is a big factor. And so with each generation, obviously, as we become more exposed to some of these toxins, you're going to see more of these diseases emerging. And it used to be just in adults that we'd see a lot of chronic diseases, but now we're seeing them a lot more in children, and that has a lot to do with it. But the last thing, after it talked about autism, that I wanted to mention too, was about some of these other autoimmune disorders and how that these things affect our body the same way through the blood-brain barrier or through the gut. Just like we talked about, it's a possibility for these things to get into our bloodstream or into our brain that normally wouldn't, and that then affects our health. And I know Shar will get more into how we can reverse that, or how that we can be able to treat it if we're already exposed. So, does anybody, any questions?
Great.
I know that's a lot of
Nice job.
information. So.